I don't need a hand. I need a wife. The voice came low and rough, drowning out the howl of the wind. Eliza, her dress heavy with water, lifted her gaze to the stranger. She had come too far, endured too many doors slammed shut, and now faced a single choice: become the wife of this man or perish in the snow. Winter of 1884, Montana. The sky was lead gray, the wind slicing across the plains like a cold blade, lashing at the earth buried deep in snow. Eliza Monroe, a thin black woman, stepped down from the freight wagon. Her worn shoes sank into half-frozen mud. Her dress was streaked with grime, the hem heavy with icy water. Her trembling hand clutched a frayed cloth bag, holding only a few old garments and a small Bible. The driver gave her a glance, snapped his whip, and the wagon rattled away, leaving Eliza alone in the vast white silence. She looked ahead. On a low rise stood a 2-story wooden house, weather-beaten but still standing. The gray timbers bore the marks of storm and sun, yet the wide porch and the chimney's white smoke told her the place was lived in. Eliza tilted her face into the wind, the chill cutting sharp against her skin. She had not eaten since the morning before. Hunger clawed at her belly, but fear gnawed deeper. This might be the last door she dared to knock upon. The wind pressed against her, and she hesitated. Her mind reeled with memories of the road, inns that turned her away, eyes filled with contempt, doors slammed shut. Out here, her dark skin marked her like a brand, making every hand withdraw. She had come too far to expect welcome. Before her stood the only chance left. Eliza drew a sharp breath, her chest rising and falling. She fixed her gaze on the heavy wooden door. Her hand hovered on the strap of her bag. A voice whispered inside her head, "If you fail here too, where will you go? Where else is left?" Her vision swam from hunger. Still, she told herself, whatever waits behind that door, she must face it. If not, the snow and wind would finish her before dawn. Her hand slipped from the bag and curled into a fist. She stepped onto the porch boards. The door loomed before her, thick, scarred with cracks and rusted nails, a survivor of many winters. She lifted her hand, then froze mid-air. Her heart hammered, breath ragged. One knock, and there would be no turning back. She closed her eyes a moment, letting the howl of the wind sound like a funeral dirge across the prairie. Then her knuckles fell against the wood. Knock, knock, knock. The sound carried through the stillness, echoing like nails sealing fate. Eliza pulled back at once, her heart leaping against her ribs. The porch stayed silent, the wind chasing swirls of snow through the air. Her lips cracked as she swallowed dry. 1 second. 2. More. Nothing stirred within. Fear rose sharp. Was the house empty? Had she wasted the last of her strength on a hollow door? A thought flickered. Turn back. Keep walking. Hope for another ranch. But she knew her body couldn't last another mile in the storm. Her hand lifted again, ready to knock once more. At that instant, a faint creak sounded from inside, the groan of a hinge. Eliza startled. The door moved, slow and cautious, as if the one within hesitated even more than she did. A thin band of golden lamplight spilled through the crack, cutting against the swirling white. The door eased wider, framing the shape of a man. Broad-shouldered, steady, his breath fogging in the cold. His face lay half in shadow, but his eyes, gray, piercing, fixed on her. That gaze cut through her like a blade, sharp and cold, yet alive. Eliza could not speak. Her heartbeat thundered louder than the storm outside. She knew this was the boundary line. If he turned her away, she would fall in the snow. If he allowed her in, she would step into a life she could not yet imagine. Her breath shook as she straightened, clutching her worn bag. The wind slid icy fingers down her neck, but her eyes never left the door. And in her heart, she whispered a last prayer. Please open. Please give me a chance. By then, the door had swung wide enough to reveal him fully. The warmth of wood smoke and pine resin spilled out, stinging her eyes with sudden heat. Eliza stood on the threshold, knowing the choice no longer rested in her hands. The door opened slow, as though it too resisted the cold outside. The man standing on the threshold was Grant Calloway. Broad shoulders, a frame set firm, a thick beard covering near half his face. His gray eyes, cold and deep, carried the weight of storm clouds before they break. Eliza Monroe stood facing him, her hand clutching the strap of her worn bag, her voice unsteady. She offered to do anything: cook, scrub, wash, mend. Each word slipped out like a last breath, fragile and pleading. It was not a beg for pity. It was the cry of someone who had reached the end of the road and found only one chance left to cling to. Grant looked straight at her, his gaze neither cruel nor kind. His silence stretched so long that Eliza thought she had made a fatal mistake. Then he spoke, rough and slow. Each word weighed before it left his mouth. I don't need a hand. The words fell heavy as stone. Eliza's lips parted, ready to ask again, but he went on before she could breathe. I need a wife. She froze. Her breath caught tight in her chest. All sound, the howl of the wind, the groan of the door, seemed to vanish. Eliza stared at Grant, searching his face for a cruel joke or some bitter trick, but there was no smile there. She stepped back half a pace, her shoulder brushing the cold wood. What did you say? Her voice rasped, raw, as if scraped by the wind. Grant leaned his weight against the doorframe, steady, unnerving. I've lived here alone a long time. I don't need someone to cook or clean. I need a wife. Eliza swallowed hard. Her whole body stiffened, her eyes locked to his face. One thought rushed through her. Turn away now, leave this house, this frozen plain, keep moving, but her feet would not lift. He paused, then spoke again, voice lowered, gentler, almost wary of breaking her. Not for me. Eliza blinked, uncertain. For the child inside, Grant said. He needs a mother. A child. A boy living in this house with the man wrapped in rumor. The town had whispered about it, but none knew the truth. Now the words came from his own mouth. She dared not ask the question pressing hard against her tongue. Where is the child's mother? She knew any answer would crush the thin hope she still carried. Her mind spun. Memories of slammed doors, cold stares, and places that turned her away surged like icy water. If she turned back now, where would she go? Snow lay deep, her stomach empty, the road ahead blind with storm. Yet if she stayed, she would bear a weight she had never dreamed of. Wife to a stranger, mother to a child she did not know. Her teeth cut into her lip, the salt of blood sharp on her tongue. A voice inside pressed her. You've come too far to turn back. You've nothing left to lose. But another whispered back, You still have yourself. Don't trade away the last of your freedom." Grant said nothing more. He simply waited. Eliza saw he did not push her. He left the choice to her, though it felt less a choice than a sentence. Accept or walk away and freeze in the dark. A sudden gust swept across the porch, snapping her skirt about her legs. She shivered, her vision blurring, and in that haze, she caught the faintest shape, a child's form in the shadows beyond the door. She thought she heard the creak of floorboards, then silence. She could not be sure if it was real, or if unseen eyes were watching her from within. Eliza swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the bag's strap. Her thoughts churned wild, yet her feet stayed planted. All roads seemed barred. In that moment, she knew her life had turned into a bend from which there was no return. Grant Calloway was not a man of many words. After opening the door, he gave Eliza's travel-worn face a brief glance, then a curt nod. No greeting, no kindness, only a gesture plain enough to mean one thing. She was allowed to enter. The inside of the cabin was stark, nearly cold in its simplicity. The walls were bare pine, rough and unpainted, carrying the scent of smoke and dry resin. A long table stood in the main room, scattered with a few tin dishes. By the hearth, a pair of mud-caked boots lay toppled beside a rifle propped against the wall. The house breathed the same hard silence as the man who owned it. Grant walked ahead, his heavy steps making the floor groan with each weight. Eliza followed close, her hand still clutching the strap of her worn bag. It felt as if every door closing behind her tightened an invisible rope around her chest. At the end of the hall, Grant stopped. The lantern in his hand spread a pale gold light across a low wooden door. He opened it, then stepped back, letting the glow fall into a narrow room. "This," he said, clipped and flat. Eliza stepped inside. The space was barely enough for a narrow bed against the wall, a battered chest beside it. The blanket was worn thin, its brown gray faded with years. The only window looked toward the stable, its pane blurred with grime and frost. She stood still, taking it in. This would be her place, perhaps for days, weeks, or months. A bare little room, closer to a cell than a home. And yet, against the storm outside, at least it had 4 walls to hold back the wind. Grant set the lantern on a small table, then turned to leave. Eliza spoke quickly. "Thank you." Her voice was so faint it seemed the prairie wind might carry it away. He paused, gave the briefest nod without looking back, and shut the door. Darkness crept across the room as the lantern's light dwindled. Eliza set her bag down and dropped onto the edge of the bed. The thin mattress sagged beneath her, releasing the dry scent of old straw. She leaned against the wall and sighed. From beyond the boards came the whistle of wind, seeping through every seam, a ghostly chorus that made the house itself seem to shudder. Each time Grant moved along the hall, the floor groaned, the sound reaching Eliza as if he still stood beside her. The weight of it kept her from easing her mind. In the dark, every creak was a reminder she was not alone, that she now lived under the same roof as a stranger whose name she had learned only minutes ago. Eliza pulled the blanket around her shoulders. It was thin, frayed, patched in places, yet it held some warmth. She curled beneath it, her hands clutching the edge. Outside, snow kept falling, the flakes tapping steady against the glass. She closed her eyes, but that only sharpened the sounds. The rush of wind through the eaves, the pop of firewood in the main room's hearth, and the heavy tread of Grant somewhere beyond. A question turned over in her mind. Had she made a mistake knocking on this door? Yet if she hadn't, where would she be? Out on the prairie, cold gnawing at her bones, death a breath away. Here, at least, there was shelter. Shelter, and perhaps a chance. For what, she could not yet name. Weariness pressed down on her. The strain of endless miles, meager meals, and nights spent in the teeth of the storm pulled her towards sleep. Before it claimed her, Grant's words returned, echoing, "I need a wife." They hung over her, a judgment she did not yet understand. That night her rest was thin, broken. Each time she turned, the boards seemed to crack and sigh, jerking her awake. More than once she glimpsed Grant's shadow passing the door, his lantern casting a long shape against the wall. No words, only that presence, heavy, silent, unyielding. Eliza drew tighter into herself, blanket pulled up to her chin. Her heart pounded, not knowing whether from fear or from the sudden weight of what she had stepped into. She could not see tomorrow, could not know if she had strength enough to become what he asked. But one truth stood firm. The door behind her had closed, and there was no road left to take. The first morning in the strange new house broke with a dim light, as though even the sun hesitated to lift the curtain of white snow outside. Eliza Monroe sat up, her body still heavy from the long road, her hair tangled after a night of restless sleep in the cold little room. Each breath she drew rose in thin puffs of smoke against the bitter air. Slowly, she slid from the bed and cracked her door. The hallway was washed in half-light, touched only by the faint glow of a lantern from the kitchen. And there, standing between shadow and firelight, she saw a small figure, a boy. No more than 6 years old, hair wild as uncombed wool, eyes dark and quiet like a still pond. He leaned against the wall, clutching a worn toy horse carved from wood, its paint chipped away by years of play. His thin frame nearly disappeared into the shadows, and only when he shifted did Eliza realize he was there. He said nothing, only watched her. The look was long, silent, as if measuring her, as if passing judgment. Eliza's throat went dry. This must be the child Grant had spoken of, the one who needed a mother. She swallowed hard, unsure of a single word to speak. What should have been a simple greeting felt heavy, dangerous, as if one wrong word could undo her before she began. The boy stepped forward, slow, careful. When he came within a few paces, he stopped. Then, without a word, he held out the wooden horse and set it in her uncertain hands. Eliza froze. The toy was cool and rough against her palms, yet it was more than a plaything. It was a key, a gate, a trial. Somehow she knew. This was the test. He had not asked, had not spoken. He simply gave her the only treasure he owned. Now she must prove she was worthy to hold it. Eliza crouched low, meeting his gaze. Her voice trembled, but she kept it warm. "Thank you." Still silent, the boy stepped back, folding his arms around himself. Eliza studied the toy. Every scratch told a story. Days of play in the yard, tumbles in the dirt, nights he had clutched it tight to fend off loneliness. Then her eyes caught on faint marks carved into the wood beneath. She traced them with her finger, heart skipping. Letters, worn but clear enough. From Alice. Her breath caught. Someone had carved those words. A woman had given this gift once. most likely his true mother. The name was carved with love, with a need to leave a trace in her son's life. Eliza's grip tightened around the horse. The room seemed quieter, the silence heavier. The boy's eyes stayed on her steady, waiting for her to reveal herself. "It's beautiful," she whispered, brushing her hand along the horse's back. "You've taken good care of it." His lashes flickered. His lips pressed shut, hiding whatever stirred inside. Then he turned suddenly and darted toward the kitchen, leaving Eliza rooted in place, her chest tangled with feeling. She returned to her room and set the horse gently atop the wooden chest. Sitting on the bed, she rested, her hand over the carved name, Alice. Memories stirred, fragments of her own mother, fragments of loss. A shadow of sadness seeped into her, but with it came understanding. She and the boy shared something. They both knew what it meant to lose, to be left without choice. When she lifted her eyes, the door was still ajar. In the hallway, his small shadow lay stretched across the floor. He stood there silently, not entering, not leaving, only watching, to see what she would do with the gift he had placed in her hands. Eliza offered him a soft smile. She crouched by the chest, carefully straightening the toy horse, giving it a place of honor. Only then did the shadow shift, the boy turning away into the dark. Eliza let out a long breath, pulling the blanket close about her shoulders. For the first time since stepping into this house, she felt a flicker of warmth in her chest. Not from the fire, but from a fragile trust, newly planted and waiting to grow. The first days in Grant Calloway's house passed slowly, but not without weight. Eliza Monroe began to find the rhythm of a new life, though each morning still opened with cold air cutting through the cracks in the wooden walls. She rose before dawn. By then, the fire in the main hearth had burned down to ash, leaving only faint red coals. Eliza knelt at the hearth, arranging the logs Grant had set aside, coaxing the embers with a stick until sparks leapt up. When the first flames caught, she leaned close, savoring the warmth as if it were a rare luxury in this frozen land. One morning, she discovered a small slate board in a kitchen drawer, its corner cracked, a stub of chalk worn nearly to dust. She wiped the board clean and set it on the table. When Jonas lingered nearby, uncertain, Eliza smiled gently and wrote the first letter. "A. This is A," she said softly. Jonas tilted his head, his dark eyes fixed on every stroke. He reached out, touched the chalk, and scratched a crooked curve beside hers. "That's right," Eliza said, not loudly, but enough to make his lip tremble faintly. Jonas bent over the board again. The letters were misshapen, clumsy, but in the effort she saw a flicker of light catch in his eyes. Each day they repeated the ritual, one letter at a time, one act of patience. The house that had been silent now carried new sounds, the squeak of chalk on wood, Jonas's small sighs when he erred, and Eliza's quiet words of praise. Beyond lessons, she mended their clothes. She stitched a patch of green thread into Jonas's worn shirt. The color did not match, but the seam was strong, and the bright stitch stood out like her own small mark upon his life. When he wore it, Eliza noticed his small hand brush the patch, then lift his gaze toward her. The glance was brief, but it told her he had noticed the care. Jonas began to answer with his own gifts. One morning a pine cone sat neatly on the table. Another day, a smooth piece of wood. Then a stone that glittered with frost was left at her door. He never handed them to her directly, but Eliza knew She kept them all, tucking them into a wooden box by her bed, as though collecting fragile proofs of acceptance. Grant watched in silence. He did not interfere. From across the room, his eyes followed them as Eliza guided Jonas's hand over chalk or bent to stitch cloth. The gray in his gaze shifted over time, still guarded, but threaded now with something quieter, almost like recognition. In the afternoons, when Grant returned from the stables or the fields, Eliza was often at the stove. A thin soup simmered, smoke curling into the air, the smell of onions and burning wood softening the edges of the cabin's cold. Jonas sat at the table, scratching lines on the slate. Grant hung up his coat, glancing around as though measuring the small changes in a house once bound to silence. Once he stopped at the table, his wide hand lifting the froststone Jonas had left. "This," he muttered. Jonas stiffened, worry flickering across his face. Eliza stepped in quickly. "He gave it to me. I think it's his way of saying hello." Grant set the stone back down. He said nothing more, but the edge of his mouth eased, just enough to soften his face. There were nights when Eliza, tending the fire, lifted her eyes to find Grant watching. He did not look away, nor did he step closer. Only a single nod, a gesture plain as words. Acknowledgement. Eliza bent her head again, but warmth touched her heart all the same. At night, lying on her narrow bed, she remembered the road behind, inns that turned her aside, faces that scorned her. And now, though this house was still strange, though danger still lurked, she had walls around her, a child placing brittle trust in her hands, and a man whose gaze was no longer as cold. This new rhythm was not yet safety, but it was a beginning, like a breath, like a seed pushing through frost, daring to live in the length of winter. That morning, the wind brushed soft against the window, carrying loose flakes that drifted onto the sill. Inside the cabin, the first light of day filtered through the slats, striping the floor with pale streaks. Eliza Monroe knelt at the shelf in the main room, sleeves rolled back, wiping away the dust that had settled over long months. To her, the work was not small. It was a way of shaping this unfamiliar house into something she could claim, piece by piece. On the shelf sat a worn Bible, its cover frayed, its pages yellowed. Eliza paused when her fingers touched it. Her mother had read from Scripture each night before bed. The memory rose sudden, tightening her throat. She lifted the book down, meaning only to dust it. As she opened it, a slip of paper slid free and fluttered to the floor. She picked it up. It was no more than a folded scrap, edges wrinkled, handwriting crooked as if scrawled in haste. She opened it, and her eyes caught the words, "Please save this child." Nothing more. No name. No hand to claim it. Eliza froze. For a moment, her heartbeat roared louder than the wind outside. Which child? Jonas. It had to be Jonas. The words cut into her like a blade, tearing open questions she had not dared to face. Her hands shook as she folded the note again. She glanced toward the hall, where Jonas often wandered silent, toy horse clutched tight. A boy of 6, quiet as shadow. And now this slip of paper, as if someone had hidden a cry for help inside the good book, hoping it might one day be found. Eliza slid the paper back into the Bible and set it on the shelf, but unease wrapped around her like wire. Her chest ached with each breath. She returned to her room and sat on the bed, palms damp with sweat despite the cold. Her mind went to the small gifts Jonas had left her. The pine cone, the smooth wood, the glittering stone. Were those tokens of trust also calls for rescue in their own way? Was the whole house built on silence too heavy for a child to carry? At midday they sat at the table together. Grant, Jonas, and Eliza, the fire burning warm enough to push back the chill. Yet silence ruled heavier than the heat. Grant ate in measured bites, his eyes flicking toward his son. Jonas kept his head down, turning his spoon in his hand. Eliza forced a smile and ladled more soup into the boy's bowl. Her gaze fell to his small fingers, and at once the image of the note flashed before her. Please save this child. Each word burned into her mind until the spoon trembled in her grip. Grant's eyes narrowed, watching her. She dropped her gaze, hiding the falter in her face. She could not let it show. She was not ready to ask, and feared the answer if she did. The meal ended with quiet strain. Jonas ate little and slipped away early, clutching his wooden horse. Grant lingered, his gaze heavier than before, as though he saw more than he chose to say. His silence pressed on her like stone. That evening, mending clothes by lamplight, the words still circled her mind. The uneven script was not Jonas's hand. Then whose? His mother's? A passerby who once stepped through? Or Grant himself in some hidden moment of weakness? The last thought unsettled her most. He was a man sealed tight, sparing in speech. If he had written such words, then his despair had been deep indeed. Eliza folded the mended shirt, her eyes drifting to the room across the hall. Jonas lay curled, horse clutched close, face hollow in the wavering light. Her chest pulled tight at the sight. That night she could not sleep. The wind lashed the roof. The boards creaked with every step Grant took outside her door. She turned and turned, but each time she closed her eyes, the note reappeared, black letters dancing on yellowed paper. At dawn, she rose again to tend the fire and ready breakfast. Grant went out as usual. Jonas sat at the table. Eliza set a bowl of cornmeal porridge before him. "Eat, it'll warm you," she said softly. Jonas lifted his eyes, dark and deep, saying nothing. But when she turned away, she noticed him nudge the bowl closer. A small sign, a faint spark. And Eliza understood. Saving a child did not always mean grand acts. Sometimes it began with simple things, an extra spoon of porridge, a steady presence, a refusal to leave. Yet the unease of the letter did not leave her. It followed her through every chore, washing clothes, the sting of cold water on her hands, splitting wood, the ache in her palms sharper than the cut of frost. Watching Grant across the yard, his frame stark against the wind, alone as a pillar against the weight of the world. Eliza held her silence. But from that day on, in every meal, in every glance across the table, the shadow of the note lingered. Like thin ice over a pond, it held, for now. But both she and the house seemed to know. One day it would crack, and the depths beneath would show. Eliza drew a long breath and told herself to wait. Whatever truth that paper carried, she was here. And she was not leaving. Winter had begun to ease. The fields, once buried deep, now showed patches of damp earth where the snow thinned in uneven gray. The winds softened, giving way to a hush, the pause before a new season stirred. In Grant Calloway's cabin, life had found its rhythm. Eliza rising each dawn to tend the fire, Jonas bending over his slate to trace letters, Grant working in the yard and returning only when the dark set in. It was quiet, steady, as though the storm of their lives had passed. But the past never closes so neatly. One afternoon, while Eliza washed clothes on the porch, the steady beat of hooves carried across the thawing road. The sound was firm, deliberate, not the passing of strangers. Jonas looked up, eyes wide, then darted into the house. Eliza wiped her hands on her apron and stepped into the yard. From the muddy track came two riders. The first was a stern-faced woman, older, her features cut sharp with a resemblance to Grant. The same gray eyes, but set beneath a brow drawn tight, her lips pressed thin. Behind her rode a younger woman, cheeks pink, dress trim, posture brimming with assurance. The horses stopped at the porch. The elder dismounted with her back straight as a rod, eyes sweeping the yard as though inspecting it. Her voice was firm, unbending. "I am Margaret, Grant's sister." Eliza's heart thudded. Her wet hands froze at her sides. She bowed her head in greeting, but before she could speak, the younger woman leapt down, skirts flaring, eyes bright. "I'm Clara," she said, voice ringing. "I came with her. I'm looking for work. I sew well. I can help around the house." The ground seemed to tilt beneath Eliza, a young seamstress, confident and skillful, brought here by Grant's own kin. It made her feel no more than a guest, a piece that could be easily replaced. The door opened. Grant stepped out, shoulders dusted with sawdust, eyes narrowing at the sight before him. "Margaret," he said, his voice heavy, not surprised but burdened. His sister met his gaze sharp for sharp. "I've heard too much talk about you living alone with that child. I came to see for myself, and I've brought someone who can help." Her eyes flicked toward Eliza, cold as a northern gale. "Though it seems you've already found someone." The air tightened. Eliza felt the blood rise in her face but kept silent. From the doorway, Jonas peered out, clutching his wooden horse, eyes troubled. Grant stepped down onto the porch, planting himself between them. He looked at his sister, then at Eliza. For a fleeting second, his eyes softened. That evening, they all sat around the table. The fire burned hot, but Eliza felt the chill sink into her bones. Margaret sat straight-backed, her hands folded, her gaze fixed on Eliza with quiet judgment. Clara moved deftly, helping with the meal, her voice lively, her smile bright, bright enough to crowd the room. Eliza sat across, steadying her hands as she ladled soup for Jonas, careful to wipe the bowl's edge. Her fingers trembled, and she knew Margaret noticed every detail. The silence was sharp until Grant set his spoon down. The clink of metal on wood broke the stillness. Then, without hesitation, he reached across and laid his hand over Eliza's. Eliza startled, eyes widening. Grant lifted his head and looked directly at his sister. His voice was low but firm, each word a stone placed with care. "I already have someone who can help me care for Jonas." The air froze. Jonas stopped mid-bite and looked at his father. Clara's mouth fell open. Margaret's frown deepened, her lips pressing tighter still. Eliza felt the warmth of Grant's hand seep into hers, a shock both steadying and disarming. Margaret drew a breath through her nose, her eyes never leaving her brother. "Are you certain, Grant? Do you know what you're doing?" His gaze did not falter. "I am certain. Jonas needs a home, and I have found someone willing to stay." Eliza lowered her head, hiding the rush of feeling inside. She had not expected Grant to speak plain, to claim her openly before his sister and the young woman she had brought. In that moment, The fragile place she held seemed anchored, if only by his words. The meal dragged on under the weight of silence. Margaret ate little, her eyes sharp as ever. Clara tried to smile, but the effort rang hollow. Only Jonas sat still, his small hand resting on the wooden horse in his lap, his gaze slipping now and then toward Eliza. When the plates were cleared, Margaret rose, her voice heavy. "If this is your choice, I won't stand in the way, but I will watch. You know I don't give trust easily." She turned, her skirts brushing the floor, and walked out. Clara followed, her disappointment written plain on her face. The door shut behind them. Only the crackle of the fire filled the cabin. Grant stayed at the table, his hand still covering Eliza's. Jonas leaned into his other arm, eyes drifting shut with weariness. Eliza drew a slow breath, her gaze falling to the joined hands resting against the wood. And there, in the heart of winter, a thin warmth spread. Fragile but more real than anything she had yet known. That night, the cabin wore its silence differently. The fire still burned, casting red streaks along the walls, but its warmth could not drive back the unease filling the air. Jonas lay curled beneath his blanket, his small face flushed red as embers, lips cracked and dry. His breath came hard, each gasp like a runner's chest heaving with no rest in sight. Eliza sat close, dipping cloth after cloth into the basin, laying them across his brow. The water warmed too quickly, drawing the fever from his skin. She brushed the sweat from his cheek, her chest tightening at the sight of him so fragile. Grant stood on the far side of the bed, his shadow long on the wooden floor, gray eyes fixed on his son. He poured water into a cup and handed it to Eliza. She lifted Jonas's head gently, coaxing him to sip. The boy swallowed only a little, most of it spilling down his chin. Eliza wiped it away, her eyes stinging. Time dragged. The wind whistled through the seams of the cabin, rising in long, mournful cries. Inside, the room filled only with the sound of wrung cloth, Jonas's ragged breathing, and the occasional crack of wood in the fire. Eliza's eyelids grew heavy, but her heart refused to rest. As she reached for another cloth, her fingers brushed Grant's hand. His was calloused, rough with years of labor, but now it trembled. For the first time, Eliza saw him stripped of the stone-cold strength he carried. His hand quivered on the boy's brow, and in the depths of his gray-sow eyes flickered something raw. Fear. Eliza looked up, catching his gaze. Neither spoke, yet in that silence she understood. His hardness was only a shell. Beneath it, he was a father, gripped by the same terror that seizes every man who stands to lose a child, even one not of his blood. "He'll pull through," Eliza whispered, unsure if she said it to comfort him or herself. Grant nodded, though the motion carried no certainty. He sank into the chair beside the bed, his hand never leaving Jonas's forehead, his eyes locked to each breath the boy fought to take. The night stretched long. Eliza cooled the fever. Grant tried again with water. They moved together, without speaking, as if they had been a family for years. At times their hands met again while bending over the child. Each touch seemed to narrow the distance between them. Near midnight, Eliza's strength wavered. She sat on the edge of the bed, her head drooping forward. Weariness pressed her down until her shoulder fell against Grant's. He started at the touch, then stilled. He did not pull away. He let her rest there, both of them watching the boy's fevered sleep. Her breath mingled with the faint scent of burning pine, with the strained rhythm of his own. And so, in the hush of the storm, Eliza drifted into uneasy sleep. Grant turned slightly, his eyes falling on her face. Sweat dampened her brow, her lips parted faintly, lashes trembling in her dreams. Fatigue lay plain across her features, yet there was a softness in her that held him fast. He looked back to Jonas, his palm still on the boy's forehead. Fear hollowed him out, but alongside it rose something else, a quiet strength, born from the knowledge he was no longer alone in this fight. Eliza's presence, wordless though it was, lightened the burden in the room. By dawn, faint light slipped through the cracks. Jonas's breathing had steadied. His fever lingered, but the fire in his cheeks dimmed. Eliza stirred awake, blinking in confusion to find her head still on Grant's shoulder. She moved to rise, but he shook his head. His eyes softened in a rare way. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and rough, but true. Eliza nodded, her words caught in her throat. She looked to Jonas, then back to Grant. His hand still trembled, but not with weakness. In that tremor she saw something else. Humanity laid bare, revealed for the first time. That night marked a crossing. They were no longer a stranger, a master of the house, and a child. Together they had faced a trial, through the long watch, through fear, through hands that could not hide their trembling. And by morning, they had begun to feel less like three separate souls and more like something whole. 3 days after the fever, Jonas was mending. His cheeks carried color again. His appetite returned, and his dark eyes no longer held the haze of sickness. Eliza felt relief each time she heard his small footsteps on the porch, or saw him at the window with the wooden horse in hand. Life had returned to the cabin, carrying a breath of ease with it. But for Grant, another weight still pressed heavy. That evening, when Jonas had gone to sleep, Eliza sat in her small room, mending a shirt torn at the shoulder. The lamp threw pale light across the table as her needle pulled green thread carefully through worn cloth. The house was hushed, save for the wind beyond the walls. Her eyes grew heavy, but her heart resisted rest. A knock came soft at the door. Eliza looked up. Grant stood there, his shadow spilling across the floor. He wore no coat, only a rough work shirt with sleeves rolled back. His face was lined with fatigue, yet his eyes carried something different, resolve, tangled with unease. "Jonas is asleep," Eliza said quietly, filling the silence. "Yes," Grant answered, his voice low. He stepped inside and closed the door. The air thickened, the lamp flame wavering between them. He paused at the table, his broad hands knotting together, then falling apart as if lost. At last he spoke. "I owe you a truth." Eliza stilled, the needle frozen in her fingers. Grant drew a breath, his gray eyes storm-dark. "Jonas is not my blood." The words fell slow but sharp, slicing the air. Eliza's hand dropped, the cloth slipping from her lap. Her heart pounded hard enough to drown the wind outside. Grant went on, voice rough. 3 years ago, one spring morning, I opened the door and found a basket on the step. Inside was a baby, no more than a few months old. There was nothing else save a blanket and a scrap of paper. Eliza swallowed, her lips unsteady. "The paper, what did it say?" His gaze fell to the floor, then rose again, as though forced. Only one line. Please care for this child. No name, no sign, no explanation. I don't know why they chose me. Maybe because my house stood apart? Maybe because they thought I wouldn't turn him away. Or maybe simply because I was there. I don't have the answer. Eliza's throat tightened. She thought of the slip she had found in the Bible, scrawled with its plea. The pieces fit together now, chillingly neat. Did you ever think of, she faltered, giving him to someone else? Grant shook his head, firm, quick. No. He was crying so hard his voice was breaking, his eyes raw. I knew I couldn't leave him. I can't explain it. I just carried him inside. From that moment on, he was mine, blood or not. His eyes dropped, and his hands curled into fists, trembling. There are nights I wonder if I've given him enough. I never learned how to be a father. I've stumbled through, clumsy, closed-mouthed, no good at soft words. But I've tried. Eliza looked at his hands, roughened by work, scarred by years. She saw not clumsiness, but the weight of a man who chose burden when he could have walked away. After a long silence, she spoke, slow, steady. Family doesn't begin with blood. It begins with those who choose to stay. Grant lifted his head. Emotion darkened his eyes, caught between storm and release. In the small room, her words rang with the strength of truth, filling the emptiness between them. Eliza set aside the shirt and needle. She rose and stepped closer, her gaze fixed on his. She saw it then, the crack in the stone of him, a glimpse of the man within. It was not weakness, but proof that he carried fear, love, and a burden unseen. Grant stood still, as though one move might shatter what had opened between them. Eliza laid her hand over his, saying nothing. Her presence was answer enough. The silence no longer yawned like a gulf, but stretched like a bridge. In the lamplight, their shadows met on the wall, closer than ever before. Outside, the wind eased, no longer howling as in nights past. It was as if the land itself hushed, making room for truth to be spoken and for acceptance to be born. That night, the cabin ceased to be only shelter. It became witness to confession and to a simple reply strong enough to bind 3 lives together. The lamp flame quivered in the narrow room, spilling a soft gold glow across the worn wooden walls. Each time the wind slipped through the cracks, the flame bent, as if trembling with the two who stood facing each other. Eliza had not released Grant's hand, and he stood unmoving, his broad shoulders as though holding the fragile space against the world outside. After his confession, silence stretched between them. Eliza felt her heartbeat hammer in her chest, the sound filling her ears. Grant, a man of few words, found none at all. Yet the hush no longer pressed heavy. It felt like a door opening, giving 2 guarded souls a single path. Eliza lowered herself to the bed's edge, fingers tracing the worn hem of the blanket. She lifted her eyes and found Grant still watching her. His gray gaze, once so hard, glistened soft, holding something both unfamiliar and near. Grant stepped forward, slow and measured, as if each stride asked her leave. Eliza did not flinch, did not turn. When he stopped before her, the distance between them no more than a breath, she saw the fine lines at his eyes, carved by years of solitude. "Tonight," Grant's voice rumbled low, each word deliberate. don't want to be alone. Something broke loose in her. All the fear, all the restraint, the walls built high through hardship, each crumbled in the space of that moment. She gave a slight nod, enough for him to know. His hand rose, rough and scarred, yet trembling as it touched her cheek. For all its strength, it carried the shiver of a man unsure, like a youth tasting first love. Eliza closed her eyes briefly, letting the warmth settle into her skin. Then their mouths met. The kiss was clumsy, hesitant, yet true. It was no storm, but a release. Years of silence and hunger for tenderness poured into a single act. Eliza felt his breath merge with hers, uneven at first, then steadying, as if their hearts were finding the same rhythm. They sat together on the bed, still holding on. Grant's hands fumbled, awkward, fearful of breaking what was fragile. Eliza gave a weary, gentle smile, as if to steady him, steady them both. "Let it be simple," she whispered. Grant nodded, gray eyes glowing like embers stirred back to life. He moved carefully, every motion restrained, making certain she was willing, certain she was safe. Eliza answered him with presence, allowing the space between them to vanish. In that narrow room the world hushed. Wind howled beyond the walls, but inside was only breath mingling, the sound of two lives loosening their long-held grip on solitude. What had been bound tight, loneliness, guardedness, shadows of the past, broke open into something bare and whole. There was no haste, no demand, only the truth of being seen and touched with care. Eliza felt the ice within her thaw, layers peeling away as though she had been locked in frost for years. Grant, awkward though he was, held her in a way that made her safe. In his arms, she was no longer a wanderer begging for shelter, but a woman seen, chosen. That night, breath guided them, slow gestures speaking more than words. Every barrier fell, until the lamp burned over two forms pressed close, their shadows cast long upon the wall. Grant whispered, voice rough with emotion, "Thank you for staying." Eliza pressed her cheek to his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. She gave no reply, letting silence carry her answer. In that silence lay every promise. Outside, the wind softened. The sky seemed brighter, though it was still night, and the small room, once only a place of confinement, became the chamber where restraint shattered, and where a new journey began, not by blood, but by the choice of two who dared to remain. Days passed on the wild land, quiet as the heartbeat of the earth. The prairie winds no longer howled. Instead, they carried the warmth of spring rising from beneath the thaw. Around the cabin at the edge of the field, change came in small signs. Snow receding to reveal dark earth, blades of grass pressing through by the fence line, smoke rising from the chimney not as a lone signal in storm, but as proof of life carried steady. Eliza Monroe stayed. Her decision was never spoken in a grand moment, never sealed by some formal word. It came simply, when she bent at the hearth to mend clothes, when she set chalk to the slate to guide Jonas through his letters, when she and Grant shared the rhythm of work side by side. No declarations, no endings, only that, day after day, she remained. And her remaining was answer enough. Grant understood. He never asked, never pressed. But each time his eyes met hers, the gray grew less cold, more certain. Jonas understood too, in a child's way. He grew accustomed to her presence, No longer just watching in silence, but sometimes stepping forward, laying a pine cone on the table, leaning his head against her sleeve. When spring fully touched the land, Grant made his offer, not with flourish, not with romance. Standing on the porch one afternoon, he said simply, "We should do it. Not for the town, for us." Eliza lifted her gaze and she understood. A wedding. Not one for the crowd, not with music or feast. Just a witness, and a vow plain enough to hold. She was silent a while, then nodded. The morning came clear and bright. Beneath the great cottonwood at the edge of the field, they gathered. The tree stood tall, its bark dark, its branches wide, young leaves catching the light. The ground beneath was soft, the breeze carrying the scent of earth and fresh grass. The wedding was so plain it scarcely looked a ceremony at all. No feast, no finery, no gowns of white. Only four stood there: Grant, Eliza, Jonas, and Margaret. Jonas stood between them, clutching his wooden horse. His eyes were solemn, older than his years, as though he knew the moment would mark a change. Margaret, arms crossed, still wore her sternness, but in her gaze had softened something small, almost hidden. She was the witness, and her presence gave Grant the recognition he needed. Grant took Eliza's hand. His palm was rough, calloused, but his grip steady. Eliza looked into his gray eyes and saw no longer only hardness, but belief chosen and held. Their vows were few, carried like the prairie wind. I choose to stay, I choose together. No florid words, no promise of forever, only truth spoken for the moment at hand. Eliza answered, her voice quiet but deep. I choose to stay, each day. Margaret drew a breath, then gave a nod, sealing the vow. Jonas stepped forward, placing his small hand atop theirs. In that touch, nothing more was needed. A family was formed. No applause followed. No flowers scattered skyward. Only the leaves of the cottonwood shivered as if in reply. Morning sunlight fell across three faces standing close: the man, the woman, and the child. When they returned to the cabin, Eliza turned once more to the cottonwood, a stillness rising in her chest. It was peace not of surrender, but of knowing she had found her place to rest. That evening's meal was no grander than any before: a pot of soup, a few slices of bread. Yet for the first time, Eliza felt the table truly theirs. Grant at the head, Jonas beside, and she across, not as guest, not as stranger passing through. She belonged. When night came, she sat at the window, looking out across the field. The wind carried the scent of soil, of grass, and the vow spoken that morning. She knew the road ahead would still hold shadow, still hold secrets not yet faced. But she had chosen. And Grant had chosen too. Family does not begin with blood. It begins with those who decide to remain, who choose not to turn away. Beneath the cottonwood, they had chosen each other, in stillness, in honesty, in the breath of the prairie. Spring came to the Montana prairie, quiet but sure. Snow melted into rivulets that slipped through cracks in the earth, coaxing green blades of grass from the soil. The sharp cold of winter gave way to the damp scent of thawing ground, to the sweet air of wildflowers budding along the hillsides. The cabin at the field's edge shifted too. The fire still burned in the hearth, no longer as a shield against bitter nights, but as a signal of gathering. Windows stood open more often, letting sunlight and spring winds pour inside. On the sill, Eliza Monroe knelt, her hands stained with soil, her eyes alight. She planted flowers, simple clusters, wild daisies, small purple blooms pressed into the softened dirt. She cupped each tender root, lowered it with care, and covered it with earth. To others it was a task small and plain. To Eliza, it was a vow unspoken. She had chosen to stay, and she meant to see the place bloom. Jonas often sat near, laughing more than before. His wooden horse rested on the porch step, no longer clutched tight. Instead, he gathered pale stones and brought them to Eliza, whispering in his husky voice, "For the flowers." A single word, but it made her pause, her heart knotting. His few words now became threads of connection. Grant Calloway watched from a distance, sometimes leaning on a spade, sometimes resting against the fence. He said little, but Eliza caught the change in his gaze. After years hardened like rock, now and then the stone cracked, and a glimmer slipped through. One evening, with Jonas racing across the yard, Eliza caught the corner of Grant's mouth curve upward. A smile. Not full, not practiced, but a true smile. The first in many long years. Their days filled with small tasks. Eliza cooked. Jonas studied his letters. Grant rebuilt the fence bowed by winter's weight. Not everything ran smooth, but no longer did it feel heavy. They grew into 3 pieces fitting together, not by blood, but by choice. One sunset, with the fields burning gold beneath the fading light, Eliza stood on the porch, her hand folded into Grant's. Jonas laughed as he tumbled across the grass. Eliza leaned her head against Grant's shoulder and whispered, soft as wind, "We don't need to forget the past. We only need to choose each other, each day." Grant's grip tightened. He said nothing, but his hand spoke what words could not. It was not promise of forever, not dream of perfection, but a choice renewed daily. Eliza gazed over the field, peace rising within her. Her past, nights of wandering, of cold beds and closed doors, faded to shadow. Grant's years of stone-faced solitude, his buried grief, began to loosen. And Jonas, the boy once left on a doorstep, bound in silence, now laughed aloud. Their story did not end by wiping away the dark. The dark remained, scars etched deep, but they had learned to live with it, to build something whole from broken pieces. The cabin was no picture of perfection, but it held the patter of small footsteps, the scent of blossoms by the window, the ring of hammer on nail, and the gaze of a man no longer turning away. It was a home made not of blood, but of staying. Spring did more than change the land. It softened the hearts inside the cabin. Each morning, Eliza opened the windows to let sunlight spill in. The scent of damp soil, the sweetness of flowers, the faint smoke of the fire, all blended into the fragrance of home. She planted more. Not just wild sprigs gathered from the field, but seeds Grant had wordlessly left on the kitchen table. She knew what he meant. One afternoon, as she pressed the seeds into earth, he stood beside her, leaning on his spade. "They'll need patience," he said quietly, "but if you tend them, they'll bloom." She looked up and saw in his eyes that he spoke of more than flowers. Jonas, too, changed in his way. No longer only watching, he smiled, even spoke small words. Each time Eliza praised him, his eyes lit before he turned aside to hide it. Sometimes he left the wooden horse behind and ran after Grant, imitating each motion, lifting a bucket, tying a rope. Grant showed little on his face, but Eliza saw him watching, lips pressed tight to hide a smile. Evenings drew them to the hearth. Jonas leaned against Eliza, holding a tattered book she read aloud. Grant sat across, asking short questions now and then, urging his son into the story. In the lamplight, their silence no longer felt empty, but full. At times, Eliza wondered if this was the dream she had once feared to dream. She had known only rooms cold and rented, eyes sharp with scorn. Now, though the house was rough and life modest, she woke each morning knowing she was needed, that she belonged. Grant opened, too, piece by piece. One day, fixing the fence, his sleeve slipped, showing a long scar. Eliza asked gently. He brushed it off as a relic of youth, then surprised her with, "Back then I thought I was unbreakable, but with that boy, I fear losing him more than anything." Eliza pressed her hand lightly to the scar. No words were needed. Another evening, they stood together on the porch, the sky washed in violet and gold. Jonas darted across the yard, laughing. Grant took Eliza's hand, fingers lacing firm. She whispered, "We don't need to forget the past, only to choose each other every day." He did not answer, only held tighter. Spring carried on, gifting small wonders. Eliza hung curtains she had sewn herself. Jonas placed a polished stone beside the flower pots. Grant carved a shelf for her spices. No one named these things, but together they built a life. At night, Eliza lit the lamp and studied the three shadows on the wall. A man, a woman, a child, not like any other family, yet no less whole. She knew they did not need to erase the dark. They only needed to face it, together. Once Jonas fell asleep at the table, book still open. Eliza lifted him to bed. When she returned, Grant stood in the swan's doorway, watching with rare gentleness. "I never thought I'd hear him laugh like that," he murmured. Eliza smiled and answered, "It isn't just you. It's because we chose to stay." That night, with spring air slipping in, Eliza knew. This was no longer shelter, but home. A home not built by law nor blood, but by three who chose each other and never turned aside. Beneath the cottonwood where their vows were spoken, there had been no music, no fireworks. Only three hands joined, choosing to remain. Now Eliza planted seeds at the window. Jonas laughed. And Grant, the man who thought he'd forgotten how to smile, let it return to his face. They had not erased the past, nor denied the dark. But each day, they chose again. And the little cabin stood as proof. Perhaps in later years, we too understand. Happiness does not come from perfection, but from those who choose to stay, to walk beside us until the road is done. What do you think? Must the past be forgotten? Or is it enough to learn to live with it, to find peace? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us talk together. If you love these Wild West love stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, so that more of us may gather for quiet evenings like this one.